So welcome to the second of our series of deep dives on the draft Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. Ko Amelia Sharman tōku ingoa, Director Sustainability Reporting, and joining me today in order of appearance are Lisa Kelsey, Jack Bissett, Judy Ryan and Steph Gray. The intent of this deep dive is to clearly explain the proposed disclosure requirements in the exposure drafts so that you can provide us with informed comments and feedback about any areas that you consider need further attention by the XRB board. So let's get started. As I'm assuming you all know by this point, the XRB is proposing that the climate-related disclosure framework, as enabled by legislation, is made up of 3 climate standards, which are collectively referred to as Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. Each draft standard is a piece of secondary legislation, and we would like to emphasise the importance of the standards being read together as a package. Today's deep dive is focusing on the exposure drafts of NZCS1 and NZCS2, paying particular attention to examples and issues relevant for financial reporting entities, our banks and insurers. We will address questions at intervals throughout the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and do please get them in early so that we can make sure we get to them. However, if we get deluged with questions and we don't get to yours today, we will respond to it after the event. We have run 2 previous deep dives, one on NZCS3 and one on NZCS1 and NZCS2 for non-financial climate reporting entities. And if you missed these, we will have recordings available on our website. NZCS3 is already there, and Deep Dive 2 will be there very soon. And if you are a fund manager, an MIS manager, the deep dive for that is happening next week. But before we get into the specifics, I'm going to cover the objective, scope, and effective date of draft NZCS1. In providing a consistent framework for entities to consider the climate-related risks and climate-related opportunities that climate change presents for their activities over the short, medium, and long term, the objective of NZCS1 is to enable primary users to assess the merits of how entities are considering those risks and opportunities, and then make decisions based on those assessments. The ultimate aim is to support the allocation of capital towards activities that are consistent with a transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. The scope section of the standard sets out which entities a standard applies to. NZCS1 applies to those entities which are required by the Financial Markets Conduct Act 2013 to prepare climate statements or group climate statements that comply with the climate-related disclosure framework. If you are unsure whether or not you are a climate reporting entity, please do get independent legal advice. And then if there is any remaining uncertainty, then please do check with the FMA, the regulator of this scheme. Now, the XRB board can issue standards that apply to interim periods, but for the avoidance of any doubt, the XRB board has clarified in paragraph 4 that NZCS1 does not apply to interim periods. And any entity that voluntarily elects to or is otherwise directed to prepare climate-related disclosures is encouraged to apply all the requirements of Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. This is to avoid cherry-picking certain of the disclosures and making it a bit confusing for people out there in the market to understand what people are disclosing. In NZCS1, Appendix B sets out the effective date. The proposed effective date of the standard is annual reporting periods beginning on or after 1 January 2023. So if your entity has a March balance date, your first climate-related disclosures will be for the year ended 31 March 2024. If your entity has a June balance date, for example, then your first climate-related disclosures will be for the year ended 30 June 2024. In today's deep dive, we're going to work through the 4 sections: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, and also assurance of greenhouse gas emissions of NZCS1 with you. But before we get started on those 4 sections, I'm going to hand over to Lisa to provide an overview of NZCS2.
Thanks, Amelia. The XRB board is proposing mostly one-year exemptions across 3 topics: strategy, metrics and targets, and an NZCS3 comparative information. These are areas where either it makes logical sense for entities to be given exemptions, such as comparatives and analysis of trends, or which represent more complicated areas for disclosure, such as Scope 3 GHG emissions. The way the first-time adoption standard works is that an entity elects to use one or more of the adoption provisions contained in the draft standard. Paragraph 25 of NZCS2 requires that if an entity elects to use any of the first-time adoption provisions contained in NZCS2, it must include a description of the adoption provisions used in conjunction with its statement of compliance. As the title of the standard suggests, these provisions are available to an entity the first time it adopts Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. So these adoption provisions are available to those 200-odd entities who are currently captured by the regime. But if at any point an entity becomes a climate reporting entity, by virtue of the fact that it meets the criteria in the Act, as a first-time adopter, that entity may apply the first-time adoption provisions. However, it is important to note that if an entity drops out of the regime to only enter a few years later, the XRB board's view is that that entity should not be able to take advantage of the first-time adoption provisions again. Paragraph 4 of the scope section sets this out. As we work through the proposed requirements in NZCS1, we will identify which disclosures have first-time adoption provisions. You will see a little smiley face icon. As we have previously communicated, the proposed disclosures are based on the Tcfd recommendations and have been informed by the exposure draft issued by the International Sustainability Standards Board. Today, we're not going to discuss how each of the XRB's proposed requirements align with the Tcfd or the ISSB. However, we have prepared comparison tables both to the Tcfd and the ISSB. These are available on our website. Each standard is accompanied by what is known as a basis for conclusions. These will be familiar to users of accounting and audit and assurance standards. But for those new to standards, the basis for conclusions is intended to provide useful explanations of the XRB board's decision-making process during the standards development. We encourage you to read these. We're now going to work through the contents of the 4 sections of NZCS1. The 4 sections in NZCS1 all follow a consistent format. Each section contains a disclosure objective, overarching disclosure requirements, followed by sub-disclosures where needed. First up, we will look at the proposed governance disclosures. In October 2021, the XRB board consulted on a proposed governance section of draft NZCS1. The main changes to the governance disclosures between the first consultation round and the exposure draft are summarised on page 16 of the consultation document. I will highlight these changes as we work through the governance section. The objective of the governance disclosures is to enable primary users to understand both the role an entity's governance body plays in overseeing climate-related risks and opportunities, and the role management plays in assessing and managing those climate-related risks and opportunities. Such information supports evaluations of whether climate-related risks and opportunities receive appropriate attention from the governance body and management. The quality of governance structures and functions are primary factors in determining whether an entity can successfully identify, analyse and manage its climate-related risks and opportunities. The governance section has 3 overarching disclosure requirements, 2 of which contain sub-disclosures. Following the feedback from the first round of consultation, the XRB board agreed with respondents that we should use a more generic term, and hence we have moved away from the Tcfd language of board to the more general term of governance body. We have also added a disclosure, as you can see on the slide, identity of the governance body responsible for climate-related risks and opportunities. This disclosure enables an entity to describe the body with the ultimate responsibility for climate-related risks and opportunities. There are 4 sub-disclosures for governance body oversight. First up, processes and frequency by which the government body is informed. This is unchanged from the earlier consultation. And this, you will disclose your channels and frequency of communication between the management and the governing body. Appropriate skills and competencies. In the October 21 consultation proposed a disclosure which was focused on how the board accessed expertise on climate-related issues, whether it was from its own internal capacity or from external sources. We received feedback on that proposed disclosure, in particular from investor bodies who wanted the XRB board to strengthen the disclosure. We are now proposing a disclosure on the screen there, which is how the body ensures the appropriate skills and competencies are available to provide oversight. We see that in the early years of the regime, this disclosure might simply reflect an entity's process of capacity building and the development of competencies that had not previously been a focal area. Next up, we have how the body considers climate-related risks when developing and overseeing implementation of the strategy. This proposed requirement has been changed since the earlier consultation to focus on the role of the governance body in developing and overseeing an entity's strategy, rather than disclosures on how climate-related risks and opportunities are incorporated into governance processes. And then lastly, we have how the body monitors progress. This is an amalgamation of earlier proposals, and it also clarifies that the performance metrics is a whether, and if so, how disclosure. There are 3 sub-disclosures under management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. These sub-disclosures are on management's role, and basically they focus on who and how climate-related risks and opportunities, where delegated responsibilities lie within the entity, and how often management are involved. That's a brief run through of the governance disclosures. I don't know if we have any questions at this stage, Amelia.
We have a couple of questions that have come through, not on governance, on other topics. We'll save those for the relative sections. But even if you don't have a question on the governance disclosures, we would like to emphasise that the governance section is really important. It is something, as Lisa said, we did get quite a bit of feedback from users about governance. It's something they're very keen to understand about. And if you do come up with a question throughout this deep dive, something makes you think about governance, we can get to your question later. So if you do have a question, put it in. Oh, and we have a question. Brilliant. Okay, in terms of governance body, is there a requirement that they be within the New Zealand entity, or could it be within a parent? Great question.
But there isn't a requirement that it has to be within the New Zealand entity. You just have to identify your ultimate body that has that responsibility.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so let's move on to Jack to take us through the proposed strategy disclosures.
Thanks, Amelia. Kia ora koutou. So this section of the presentation outlines our proposed strategy disclosures following feedback we received during the last round of consultation. Thanks to all of you who provided us with feedback. So this section is about your core business model and strategy. It's fundamentally about what your entity is trying to achieve and how. It's not about having a separate climate strategy. It's about answering for your primary users, how will climate change impact you? How's it already impacting you? And how you're positioning your business model and strategy in anticipation of transformational changes to the world around you. Primary users are increasingly expecting that an entity can back up its claims that their business model and strategy are resilient to climate change. Therefore, the strategy section of NZCS1 requires an entity to cover quite a broad range of issues, as demonstrated by this broad objective at the top of the strategy section. And we acknowledge that there is a lot in this, probably the largest section for entities to work their way through. So for instance, an entity must demonstrate that it understands the risks and opportunities it's exposed to, can explain the scenario analysis it has undertaken, the current and anticipated impacts of climate change, the financial impacts, and the transition plan aspects of your strategy. So I'll now work through each of these areas through the rest of this section, these 4 high-level disclosures. And the key things that have changed since last time at a sort of higher structural level include the new structural component on the far right, how the entity will position itself, which creates the 4th high-level disclosure. And this is where the transition plan aspects of the strategy are contained. And then on the left-hand side, summary ordering to better reflect the process that entities go through in preparing disclosures, and also influenced by the structure of the ISSB's proposed strategy section. So starting off with the first of the 4 high-level disclosures, current impacts and financial impacts. This section is about primary users looking for insight into how climate change currently affects an entity. So given that we're already in a world that includes 1.1 degrees of warming, given the significant and ongoing extreme weather events we're seeing, the changing societal and political factors we already live with now, primary users increasingly want to see evidence that entities understand what all of this means for their business and that their most recently reported financial position and performance. So, as noted by the IPCC, just to capture the essence of this, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. For instance, you might have been forced now within your own entity to do things like change aspects of your operations, alter priorities, adjust perspectives on what can and cannot be controlled throughout the value chain due to these types of physical and transition impacts. You're not required, however, to calculate the exact proportion of a climate-related impact or what proportion of a climate-related impact was attributable to climate change. So, for example, with flood damage, that can be considered an impact resulting from the climate, but there's no need to attribute what proportion of the impact of a given flood event resulted from climate change above and beyond a business as usual flood event. Cross-industry metrics that Judy will touch on later, they provide a useful starting point in identifying these current financial impacts. And we do suggest, and we're suggestive of this throughout the standard, that you begin qualitatively and build in quantification over time. Quantification is most likely to be a range in this context, and in some cases quite a broad range, subject to high levels of uncertainty. We have proposed a 1-year first-time adoption provision for financial impacts, and that's the same for all aspects of the strategy section that are about the financial impacts, and that's available for entities that want to take up this option. And then also note with that third disclosure there around an explanation of why quantification is not possible, that disclosure is also available for those impacts that you consider you can't precisely quantify, and in that case you need to explain why that is the case, and qualitative information on the current financial impacts. So compared to previous proposals on this, we have amended the language. Some may have noticed this change now about current, which replaces actual, and later on when I get into anticipated financial impacts, we've moved that away from the word potential, which is to align with the ISSB's language. So I'm going to start using some examples now, and a quick disclaimer before I do that. So these examples are from voluntary disclosures. So these examples and all the other examples we show throughout, they're made under a voluntary regime, not necessarily with our proposed standards in mind. And so we're only using these examples to communicate the type of information we would generally expect to be disclosed at a basic broad level of abstraction. So we don't necessarily think these are best practice, and we don't endorse them, nor have we reviewed the rest of the disclosure statements that these entities have made. Okay, so here's the example, which is getting at current impacts of climate change disclosed by Aviva. So you can see in 2021, Aviva's looking backwards to 2017 at actual catastrophic weather-related losses compared to what was expected. And basically they have some narrative supporting these disclosures about performing relatively well compared to what was expected, and then citing, well, partly a reflection of the type of business they do and the way that they're spread across different jurisdictions and with a different product mix. Moving on now to scenario analysis. Primary users are interested in understanding the scenario analysis process that you have followed and what the core assumptions underpinning the analysis were, and whether these align with those used by your peers. So this includes at least 3 scenarios: a 1.5 degrees climate-related scenario, 3 degrees or greater scenario, and then a third scenario where the temperature outcome is open for choosing. Following feedback that we received in the last round of consultation, we've increased the minimum number of climate-related scenarios from 2 to 3. We've increased the upper bound temperature outcome from greater than 2 degrees to greater than 3 degrees. And this was in response to concerns that there wasn't enough exploration of the high physical risk end of the spectrum if it was just greater than 2 degrees, given we're on track for something greater than 3 at the moment. And also concern around if we only were requiring 2 scenarios to be considered, that was below the level of standard good practice, which is at least 3, potentially 4 or more scenarios. And then if there's only 2 in play, then entities can start to see them as a good and a bad, rather than them being all of them being plausible futures that are for exploration, rather than being subjective choices about future. We're not proposing any first-time adoption provisions for scenario analysis, despite some who submitted thinking that would be needed. We think that scenario analysis can be conducted by any entity basically immediately, as there's no requirement here to quantify the outcomes of scenarios using complex quantitative modeling or the like. Scenario analysis in this context is first and foremost a tool for strategic thinking, and we believe all entities in this regime are capable of that. We have published some guidance on how to get started on scenario analysis at the sector level, and a fact sheet which clarifies the definition and purpose of scenario analysis in this regime. So those are both available on our website. So getting a little deeper into the swimming pool now. So as I touched on, scenario analysis, what is it? This is a process for systematically exploring the effects of a range of plausible future events under conditions of uncertainty. So the primary purpose of doing this kind of analysis here is to test the resilience of the entity's business model and strategy to multiple scenarios. Given we do not know which scenario we will ultimately face as a global community, this means an entity can begin to think about how to build resilience to the prospect that any one of these quite divergent scenarios plays out. And in doing that, going through this process, climate-related risks and opportunities themselves are typically identified, which then feeds into the wider disclosure process. And we are conscious for financial institutions that scenario analysis can be used for other purposes as well. And we are not saying that that's necessarily a bad idea, but we do want to make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of what we mean by scenario analysis in this context. So it's important to have a good look at the definitions and the purpose that we're talking to there. So earlier in the year, the XRB reached out to engage with sectors to encourage entities to start on scenario analysis at the sector level. So many sectors are already doing so, and further sectors continue to start collaborative projects. We are aware that the banks and the insurers are both underway in this regard, and the insurers are out the other end. So be interesting to hear increasingly from the insurers involved in that work about how they found it. So the reason that we've been encouraging this sector level collaboration is because this translation of high level information starting at the top left of that diagram, which is about global patterns of change, all the way down to your individual entity level, is quite a distance to travel. And we think sector collaboration helps to ensure that this translation is done in a more consistent way, more efficiently than all entities doing this separately and individually, and provides a chance to get some good expertise involved in the process from early on. And what we're really trying to do then is to help climate reporting entities to avoid this situation on the left, where there's inconsistencies in assumptions for no good reason, and then difficulties with consistency and comparability, and move to this more towards the situation on the right-hand side, which we believe will result in more consistent and comparable disclosures, both within your sector and then across all of the different sectors in the regime. This is, however, not a mandatory part of the standard, but we have been reaching out to encourage it, and obviously, thanks to insurers, have taken up the baton on that front. So we think it should provide, make the job easier of meeting the standard. So here's a brief update where we understand all the different sectors are at within the economy as well. So obviously the marine sector complete, along with the insurers up the top. Then we have tourism, obviously banking, and then materials and buildings, agriculture, basically next most advanced. Then we have retail and some of the fund managers, etc., starting to get on board, as well as healthcare. So that is a quick snapshot of where everybody's at, and we think it's going to be busy times over the next year with everybody having this work underway all at the same time, and encourage everybody to be doing what they can to be coordinating and trying to peer over the other fences to stay abreast of other developments, and we're happy to help on that if anybody wants to reach out to us. Okay, moving on now to climate-related risks and opportunities, a cool piece of information in this section. So along with the basically climate-related risks and opportunities that you have identified, this sub-disclosures require explanation of how you've defined timeframes, so short, medium, and long term, how these link into your strategic planning and investment processes, when you anticipate the financial impacts from each of these risks and opportunities will occur, the categorization in terms of whether they're physical or transition. You also need to describe how these risks and opportunities serve as an input into financial planning processes, including for capital deployment and funding. And yeah, again, at the bottom, we have the smiley face. So we do have the first-time adoption provision available here for the financial impact aspects of this sub-disclosure. Okay, so just trying to make sure everyone's on top of some of these core ideas. Many of you will already be familiar with these physical and transition risks, but just to quickly recap for those who may not be. Physical risks and opportunities on the left, they can arise due to the physical impacts of climate change. So these can be acute, event-driven, such as increased severity of extreme weather events, or they can be relatively longer term chronic shifts, things like shifts in precipitation, temperature, and increased variability in weather patterns. Transition risks and opportunities on the right-hand side, these arise due to the basically human response to climate change. So the transition to a lower emissions, climate resilient global and domestic economy includes things like policy and legal, technology and market and reputational risks. Just to note that we have updated the definition of transition risks in the standard to effectively include both mitigation and adaptation actions within them. So that's where an acknowledgement that in New Zealand and increasingly globally, we're actually trying to transition to a lower emissions and climate resilient economy. And therefore this world of sort of seeing adaptation on the left and mitigation on the right is shifting, and we are starting to integrate more how adaptation and the response to basically a warmer world are coming through. And in terms of the standard, we would expect these risks and opportunities to be disclosed in a way that's specific to your entity and therefore in more detail than how they appear here. Okay, so just to bring an example of how they start to look, here's Aviva, so an insurance slash asset manager, asset owner example. Maybe just to dive into the insurer aspect of this on the bottom left. So Aviva's laying out risks that it's seeing from climate change, and as an insurer that includes disruption to the general insurance market. So for example, moving to electric and autonomous vehicles that in a widespread way, or changes in extreme weather that impacts on product design and demand, as well as affordability of insurance products in some cases, and then disruption to the life insurance market. Things there could be changes in the morbidity or mortality rates as a result of, say, lower air pollution that we get from the transition, or on the other hand, a reduction in healthcare spending, and an increase in the prevalence of certain health conditions with the higher temperature scenarios. So those kinds of risks that Aviva is currently disclosing. Okay, moving on to the anticipated impacts and financial impacts. These are intended to inform a primary user's view effectively of the entity's attractiveness as an investment option. So here it's important that preparers bear in mind that this information need not be precise to be relevant to primary users. And in most cases here, it can and should remain quite broadly expressed using ranges. So to help give a sense of the scope of what's under the hood of anticipated financial impacts, Tcfd has guidance on this, and they effectively lay out three key prongs, which is firstly the entity's exposure to and the anticipated effects of specific risks and opportunities that we just worked through. Secondly, the entity's planned responses to manage its risks and seize opportunities, and then the impacts of those responses on the financial position, performance, and cash flows. Because this area of translating this climate-related impact information into the financial impact information, is a new field, and entities are building the muscle, so to speak, at the moment in terms of actually doing that and disclosing it comprehensively. We're again proposing a one-year first-time adoption provision for entities who want to take it up. You'll also may notice that there's this term reasonably expected on the end there of those first two disclosures, which we've added from last time, recognizing the degree of uncertainty involved with this kind of analysis and aligning with the ISSB, which we received feedback on. Okay, so for these anticipated, more forward-looking impacts, here's an example from Allianz Group, an insurer and asset manager. So you can see that they include basic qualitative information here on the anticipated impacts to the assets held. And this is based on a top-down qualitative transition risk type of analysis over the investment portfolio. And they did also supplement this with other top-down and bottom-up analysis as well. And here's an example, again, anticipated more of the financial impact side now from Schroders, a large asset manager. And you can see on the right there under impact, they have qualitative information basically, which is, about the financials. So this kind of information we would see as kind of the very base level for disclosure of anticipated financial impacts. So under NZCS1, there is the basic requirement that you would be quantifying these unless you consider that you're unable to do so, in which case you'd be disclosing both the qualitative information and why. And the qualitative information, we would be encouraging and primary users are increasingly wanting to see, that needs to be as detailed as you can possibly get to. Just a quick note for anybody who is an MIS manager, that this is a Schroders example, which is effectively starting at their corporate headquarters level, so covering the whole entity, not just zoomed in on their scheme under management, which is what the New Zealand legislation for MIS managers hones in on. A quick note on confidential information. So we have heard feedback about some concern about disclosing potentially confidential information. These are concerns that are not uncommon globally, and the Tcfd has been hearing this for, back to 2017. We think that an entity cannot claim business confidentiality as a reason for avoiding disclosing under NZCS1, but in saying that, judgment will be required as to just how granular the disclosures are, particularly with respect to opportunities. And in exercising that judgment, Tcfd has suggested considerations here, those two blue boxes, and we would suggest starting, again, broader, more qualitative information and getting more specific over time. But really, the ultimate disclosures should be as specific as the entity deems to be practically and commercially possible, and not be so broad so as to be unclear for primary users. Okay, moving on to this fourth disclosure area around how the entity will position itself. So this disclosure provides an opportunity to communicate how entities intend to strategically position in the context of the global and domestic transition to a low emissions, climate resilient economy. Therefore, entities need to describe, what are they doing on their end to basically ready themselves to operate effectively in a world that's trying to rapidly reduce emissions and adapt to the unavoidable consequences of climate change. And really, this is trying to both get entities acknowledging challenges while setting out a coherent case and not a misleading case for how these challenges can be overcome from the entity's perspective to give primary users comfort that their investments are resilient to climate-related risk. So here is where the disclosure on business model and strategy comes through. And this is sort of moved location from our previous proposals. We did receive predominantly positive feedback on this short disclosure on the business model and strategy. And, again, we emphasize this is only expected to be a brief description and can use things like diagrams of your business model and a short paragraph explaining the key components of your strategy. Again, in this section, there's a first-time adoption provision available for disclosing the transition plan aspects of your strategy. However, at the same time, we would note there is a lot of pressure coming on now from primary users wanting to see transition plans, and we only expect that to grow over time, so it's something to be conscious of. So getting into a little bit more detail now around transition planning. In the last draft of our proposals, we proposed something more akin to what's on the left-hand side here. So the separate disclosure of adaptation plan and transition plan aspects of the overall strategy, which was aligning with the Tcfd's recommendations. However, we are no longer proposing the separate disclosure of adaptation plans. And the reason for that is that, well, since we made those proposals, global standard setters have made important, slightly different proposals in this area, which effectively proposing that a transition plan would integrate adaptation actions within it. We've also had a New Zealand the Climate Leaders Coalition update their member statement, which effectively does that to integrate mitigation and adaptation in one climate action plan, they've called it. And we did get some feedbacks noting that if we have adaptation both separate and giving longer lead-in time for disclosure in that area, that adaptation will continue to be seen as a less important issue for entities to be getting on top of and disclosing information to primary users about. So these are the changes that we've made in responses to just require disclosure of effectively a broader definition of a transition plan. So that's important to be aware of, and then important to think about in terms of what guidance exists already. So this picture is just giving a sense of what else is out there in the big wide world of transition plan information. So we have, as I mentioned, lots of existing guidance, but also on the left, we have standards now coming through, important global baseline standards from the International Sustainability Standards Board on transition plans, then important moves as well from the likes of the US Securities and Exchange Commission and existing rules in the UK. Then when it comes to guidance, a lot is out there already. And as I said, a lot of it is a bit more focused on this idea of transition in the sense of a mitigation-centric challenge. So that's what we'd see a lot of this guidance as primarily targeted at, but everyone, I think, is doing their best to integrate the response to physical risks and the adaptation aspects within a more integrated framework. And then we have these voluntary commitments and criteria, which many of you on the call today will be signed up to and working towards. So the Climate Leaders Coalition, and then the UNEP-FI, the Net Zero Banking and the Net Zero Insurance Alliances, which have voluntary commitments and criteria that you're, I know, are looking at and having regard to and busily working towards meeting. And then probably the most important one in the middle there is the GFANS guidance, which is the Global Financial Alliance on Net Zero, which has published recent transition planning guidance. And so I guess what we're encouraging is, make use of what exists, what's most relevant for you, but at the same time do have an eye on the future evolution in this area, which we think is going to be to bring probably some more aspects in, including adaptation and potentially other things too. Okay, so just to work through this GFANS guidance, just to give everyone a little bit more of a look under the hood about the kinds of things that then come through as basically the components of a transition plan. So you can see we have, quite a lot in here really, in terms of what's increasingly expected, both to develop a clear transition plan and to meet primary user needs. So, it's worth being aware of. It's a lot of work to develop a credible transition plan. And really the expectation is also that it's integrated into the core business model and strategy. It's not a separate plan that's just sort of over on the side, which meets the need to reduce emissions. But, I think the expectation from primary users is to be able to say, well, if you have multiple goals, how are these all pointing in one direction rather than being in conflict and potentially being some being prioritized over others. Here's an example of a transition plan from Aviva. So again, the insurance asset owner, asset manager type example. So Aviva, basically the first major insurer worldwide to target what they're calling net zero carbon by 2040. So they launched this March this year. And as you can see, so they have a fair bit up the top around what their objectives are, strategy and priorities, and then an ambition statement setting out their sort of priority areas and scope. Then they have a timeline with a roadmap of actions out to 2040 with interim goals and targets, and then immediate steps that it's going to take, which is where the spotlight's increasingly coming on, is sort of not just wanting to see 2050 net zero emissions reduction targets, but both interim targets and actions in the short term that entities are taking now to get on top of things. And so Aviva signalled as part of this that this would be a plan that would be refreshing and strengthening over time. And, important for the insurance sector, I think, acknowledging that, well, many of the pieces of the puzzle for this kind of a plan are still seen as imperfect. So the data is imperfect, methodologies are not necessarily 100%, but they note that, well, these will continue to evolve, and Aviva noted, or can't wait for everything to be neatly laid out and made perfect before it puts something like this together, given the nature of climate change and where we're at. Citigroup is a banking example, maybe a little bit more engagement centric. So they've effectively leveraged the work they were already doing around client engagement on climate change and transition planning amongst their clients. And so they have basically, through those kinds of engagements, been looking to understand whether their clients have business strategies that have been integrating climate considerations, whether they have transition plans, and have done some work around capacity building and that sort of thing. And they have noted in their transition plan context that they're conscious of and working on this potential mismatch between what they may set out in their transition plan as a financial institution for sort of 2030 emissions reduction targets here, and then what their clients have in terms of decarbonisation or net zero trajectories, hence their focus on engagement, as well as getting their own plans and targets underway.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack. That was a really comprehensive run through of the section. So as Jack said at the beginning, there's a lot in there. So we really hope that was helpful, and we've got lots of questions. I'm going to kind of ask them in reverse order. So a couple on transition plans, Jack. So Aviva's transition plan is just emissions focused, but the XRB expectation that our plans will be much broader. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, so that's right, that our expectation is that they'll be broader. So you would be expected to be able to speak to what is happening on the adaptation side of the fence, if anything. And we do expect that, given the ISSB, the US SEC are moving in this direction, that, and I think someone like the GFAN's guidance itself has noted in the sort of areas for further work, the need to be integrating adaptation. We see that as the next protocol. We are developing guidance around to try and help entities to do that integration job, but it is a bit of a multiple worlds colliding at the moment in terms of what's always been seen as sort of mitigation over there a little bit and adaptation over there. And really, we think where it boils down a little bit is in that strategy and the question about, is this really integrated, or is this something over on the side? And is the entity laying out basically a separate transition plan that ticks the box, or are they bringing climate change considerations all the way through its strategy setting processes and really basically turning the ship to where it's going to be effective in a low emissions and climate resilient world, which at the same time we would acknowledge is not easily done or necessarily quickly done in terms of doing that kind of work.
Thanks, Jack. And one other question on transition planning is there an expectation that a transition plan be a standalone document, or can we summarise how it is addressed in various strategies and plans?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, this is a result of basically Tcfd recommendations back to probably more like 2020 when this idea of transition plans emerged, and they really emerged in response to the concern everyone had that there was increasingly good progress in terms of ambitious net zero emissions reduction targets, maybe alignment of business and investment activities with 1.5 degree aligned pathways, but then no evidence about how entities were going to get there. So then this idea of transition plans emerged. Tcfd recommended the disclosure of them, but really, I think good practice is not to see it as a separate plan and to see it as something that needs to go on within your entity, is to basically think about how you're going to transition and how you're going to continue to be effective as everyone around you transitions. And then when it comes to disclosure is where, yeah, absolutely, there's no requirement to have a separate document. We would certainly encourage you not to think about it as, separate, but you just have to disclose the transition plan aspects of your strategy. So what primary users want to see are the key bits that, are well summarized. So it's what's your target if you do have one, what are your interim targets, what are your actions, how do they work together in that kind of timeline type sense, so that there's evidence that there's a coherent plan. So I think that's what primary users want, is the highlights of what's under the hood, likely to be a more extensive set of information.
And thanks to Jack, and I would also emphasise on the presentation of disclosures, there is a whole section in NZCS3 on the location of disclosures. So you can put your climate-related disclosures into different documents. However, it's really important, based on that principle of fair presentation, which is the overarching principle in NZCS3, and then the sub-principles that are also in there, that by doing that, you're not making it more difficult for the primary users to understand. It's really got to be coherent and it's got to be understandable. So it's about making sure that the way that you present this type of information is going to be useful for the primary user in terms of how they read and understand information about you. All right, so kind of another question linked to presentation, which is there a requirement for these disclosures to be narrative, or can we use diagrams to communicate things like risks identified?
Thank you. Yeah, I'd say there's no requirement for it to be specifically narrative. I think that the disclosures are written in a way that's probably more suggestive of narrative, but absolutely, if you want to use diagrams or anything else that you think is going to more clearly communicate the information to primary users, then that's possible.
All right, and how should financial impacts be articulated? Does it need to be described in terms of dollars? The examples didn't include this level of information.
Yeah, it is a good question in terms of whether you ultimately need to get to dollars or not. And I think that, as an emerging area at the moment, financial impact disclosures tend not to be getting to that level of dollars, but there are examples out there where reporting entities have managed to get there. So I think we would encourage people to be effectively striving, and remember that we're talking about having a 1-year first-time adoption provision. We're encouraging everyone to start more at that risk opportunities and work that through to impacts and then financial impacts kind of a logic here, but to be striving to get to dollar figures if and where you can, and where you think that that is the clearest way to communicate the information to primary users without putting the square peg in the round hole too much. So I think that I would be, if I was approaching it, striving to do it where possible, where that's the clearest, but then if you get to through the work and you start to think that, well, this is just not meaningful, it's not possible to get into, even just quantification in general, not necessarily the expression of it in a dollar term is where you need to make judgment calls along the way about how far you can go, and then disclose, in the kind of worst case scenario, fall back on qualitative descriptions, more like that Schroeder's example about revenues could go up here, decrease over here, and then, building in ideally some more range and sense of scale around that. Yep.
Great, thanks, Jack. Yeah, the ranges, it's a really important point. So on scenario analysis, what is the rationale for still having a 1.5 degrees scenario when that's pretty much business as usual now anyway?
That question, second part of that question took me by surprise a little bit. I thought that was going to say something different. So, I think that the important to recognize that scenario analysis for this particular purpose, and conscious that for banks and insurers, you may also have scenario analysis happening for other purposes, and being conscious of climate scenarios around things like sea level rise and exactly where people are drawing boundaries for things like more like a risk management type process. Here, we're really emphasizing that, this is about exploring plausible climate futures, and effectively as laid out by the IPCC, and then work down to a national and sector level, and then an entity level for you. So 1.5 degrees, for example, there's increasingly less likelihood we'll be able to get there from a global perspective in terms of emissions reductions, but the purpose of it is to effectively explore and really work out, well, what are the extreme ends here in terms of what could happen, and then how can my business model and strategy be most resilient in the context that, we could get to 1.5 degrees, or we could get to something much worse, greater than 3. How can I start to make strategic choices and changes that sets us up to best be effective, given we don't know which world we're going to end up in.
Thanks, Jack. And last one for you. This is a higher level one, which I think is a really good one to have asked. Thank you. What if a reporting entity has determined climate change is not material to its business? Are we still required to outline the current impacts?
Sure. So yeah, really good question. So maybe two parts in general. I think this is important to remember. This is a disclosure regime only. And you are, as an entity, responsible for making judgments around materiality. So yeah, if you're going to make, basically come to conclusions that certain things are not material, you are free to do that and then disclose that fact. And then when it comes to current impacts in particular, might be an area where entities particularly consider that the current impacts of climate change are not material. Again, you're free to communicate that kind of information to primary users, and maybe for current, you'd be of the mind that nothing's obvious or significant enough yet, but I think that there is definitely a challenge in this area, because to some extent, until you put yourself through it, and until you actually even do the work to say what are the current financial impacts of climate change, and then actually go away and do the work on that, it is, I'd say, a dangerous position to just make the assumption outright. And I think this is where, with this regime, there's increasingly the light being shone on, effectively from the primary user saying, well, if you're going to make an assumption like that, A, that may not hold, and we want to see you do work on this. And B, once you do the work, you may come to a different conclusion.
Excellent. Thanks for the answer. All right. So that's it on strategy. We're going to move on to risk management, and back to Lisa.
Hello. Gosh, lots of good questions. I was really listening carefully there. So risk management. Okay, let's now look at the proposed risk management disclosures. We have basically, the objective of the risk management disclosures is to enable primary users to understand how an entity's climate-related risks are identified, assessed, and managed, and how those processes are integrated into existing risk management processes. Primary users want to know that entities have robust risk management processes in place. It is important to note that these disclosures are focused on climate-related risks and on the processes, not the outcome. This section contains two overarching disclosure requirements, one of which has sub-disclosures. There are 5 proposed sub-disclosures under climate-related risk management processes. And we'll just quickly run through those. So basically, first up is the tools and methods used. So these are a significant contributing factor for a primary user in determining whether an entity identifies and assesses climate-related risks robustly. Some examples are scenario analysis, stakeholder engagement, hazard maps, etc., etc. Time horizons. This is a description of the time horizons that you have considered. And a primary user would expect a coherent approach to timeframes. Jack talked about timeframes earlier in the strategy section. Value chain. NZCS3 contains a general requirement that an entity must consider the exposure of its value chain when considering its exposure to climate-related risks and opportunities. So this disclosure is asking for the parts of the value chain that you have excluded when you've looked to identify your risks and opportunities. And following feedback from our earlier consultation, the XRB board have amended this disclosure to whether any parts of the value chain are excluded. Previously it asked for which parts you had included. Next, we have frequency of assessment. So obviously review and revision on a regular basis to maintain your relevance and currency. So just letting the primary user know your process is there. And then lastly, your process around how you prioritise your climate-related risks. And this disclosure is a combination of earlier disclosures that we had. And note, we deleted our earlier proposal on how a climate makes decisions to mitigate, transfer, accept or control these climate-related risks, as we feel this will be covered under the strategy section. So we're just going to look at a couple of examples. So here's an example of a financial sector risk management disclosure, in this case from Citibank. It is important to bear in mind, of course, that this disclosure was made under a voluntary recommendations of the Tcfd rather than the mandatory standard NZCS1. Citibank have taken the view that climate change is a broad spectrum risk affecting all other types of risks it needs to manage. To understand climate risk in more depth, Citi have specific climate-related risk identification and categorisation process, and are developing an end-to-end climate risk management framework to fully integrate climate risk. To date, Citi has employed a qualitative risk review process, but is working towards a quantitative approach. Here is an example of Citi's investigation of the role climate risk drivers play across the bank's 7 key risk categories. Obviously, there's a lot going on here, but it might be worth drawing your attention to a couple of aspects of Citi's analysis, which highlights the scope and scale of climate-related risks in the financial sector. Firstly, Citi are screening the entire banking ecosystem and attempting to better understand the risk it is facing. And secondly, it views climate change as a core reputational risk. If its own performance on climate resilience and transition fails to inspire confidence among investors and stakeholders. Next example is Swiss Re, that provides another example of risk management disclosure and practice, this time from the perspective of a global reinsurer. And again, the caveats apply with respect to voluntary versus mandatory disclosure practices. Like all insurers and reinsurers, Swiss Re has long been in the business of risk management. The emergence of climate-related risks as a systemic threat to financial stability is therefore something that they feel well placed to address. This is a commonly held perspective, but should perhaps be balanced against the view that in the round, the financial sector has yet to adequately price in climate-related risk, which is after all what drove the Financial Stability Board to establish the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures in 2015. Swiss Re do, however, make the case to investors that their risk management processes are robust to climate risks in several ways. For example, Swiss Re describe a full suite of transition risks that they are monitoring, including changing legal risk exposure resulting from climate change. Swiss Re also highlight the emerging prominence of secondary perils, i.e. smaller natural catastrophe events such as localized flooding, storms, or wildfires, fostered by a warming climate, urbanization, and increasing asset values in exposed areas. The process that Swiss Re highlight as capturing the increasing prominence of secondary peril risk in the reinsurance market is threefold: capturing macro trends, mapping peril correlations, and raising the prominence of secondary peril oversight in governance and pricing evaluations. Next slide, thank you. The Swiss Re example highlights the need for additional risk considerations that traditional risk management processes and approaches may not fully address, as the Tcfd table on the characteristics of climate-related risks illustrates. In particular, novelty, nonlinear dynamics, and the complex systemic effects of climate change will likely require new approaches to risk management that entities may not yet have fully engaged with. The second overarching disclosure requires an entity to describe how climate-related risk identification, assessment, and management is integrated within existing processes and practices. And we'll pause there for any questions on risk management.
Thank you. All right, we've got a question here. For the value chain disclosure, how far do you go? i.e., would you need to review the supply chains of all your suppliers in case they would be impacted? It can get very large very quickly.
Yes, I absolutely can. I guess it is important you look through your value chain, and I think materiality will play a part here as well. I don't know, Amelia, what really to say in respect of how far they need to go.
I think the key thing is, yeah, as Lisa said earlier, so we initially had a disclosure which is talking about all of your value chain, and based on feedback, we heard that could get bigger than being heard very quickly. So we have amended that disclosure to ask about which parts of your value chain are excluded and why. So for example, you may say, we have not gone into XYZ part of the value chain because we do not have the information, or we do not, we think that is too far down at this stage. So it's really important that, yes, NZCS3 does ask an entity to think about its value chain. Entities are not individual islands in terms of climate risk, it's all interconnected. But that disclosure about exclusions, it just gives your primary user a sense about which bits you're looking at, how far you might be able to go. So for example, you're an entity and you have a global value chain, you might hone in on a particular part of your value chain, maybe a subtropical region where you have a lot of manufacturing because there's a higher potential incidence of extreme weather events, and that might be why you hone in on that and explain why you're not talking about the other bit. Okay, so what would you consider as integrated risk management practices within management? Can you give examples? I'm not quite sure what that question means, I'm sorry. We might need to come back to you on that one later on after the event. Anyone else in the team want to jump in? Feel free, but I will move on to the next question, which is more of a general question. And Lisa, this is a good one for you as well. This is a general question, but who do you see as the end user for New Zealand insurers where investment isn't direct into the New Zealand entity, but into the Australian parent?
Okay, can you read that? What? The
primary user question. Who do you see as the end user, the primary user, as for New Zealand insurers where investment isn't into the New Zealand entity but into the Australian parent? So an investment in an insurer where investment is actually made into the Australian parent rather than into the sub entity, the New Zealand entity. Who is the primary user for someone that has an Australian parent?
Well, in my mind, it's the same primary use that we have defined in the standard. I don't know if that's, am I interpreting the question correctly?
Yeah, so I would say, so for every entity, you've got to think about who is actually investing into that entity. So if the investors are investing into the Australian parent, then it is them as primary users. So you're a New Zealand entity, but you are part of that Australian parent. So if your investors are investing into the Australian parent, those would be your primary users. So a reminder that the primary user definition is your existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, that's everything on risk management. Thank you, Lisa. Again, if you've got any questions in the audience and you want to send them through later. But now we will pass over to Judy for metrics and targets.
Ngā mihi, Amelia, tēnā koutou. Metrics and targets is where an entity's greenhouse gas emissions are disclosed, as well as other metrics and targets, and assurance is required over those greenhouse gas emission disclosures from October 2024 onwards. The objective for disclosing metrics and targets information is to allow your primary users to better assess your potential risk-adjusted returns, general exposure to climate-related issues, and progress in managing or adapting to those issues. These disclosures should be about describing the metrics and targets that you use to manage your climate-related risks and opportunities. They should inform and be informed by your governance, strategy, and risk management processes and create a feedback loop over time in the same way that your other key performance indicators and key risk indicators are used to inform your business management processes. The proposals require disclosure of cross-industry metrics. These are considered to be relevant to all businesses, regardless of the industry and business model, and we'll cover these in more detail shortly. The proposals require disclosure of relevant industry-based metrics. We are not proposing to specify these metrics. You can select the industry metrics which you use. You may wish to consider the industry-based metrics from the International Sustainability Standards Board. It has picked up the SASB standards and is looking to adapt these for a global context. The appropriate metrics and targets for a given financial institution will depend on your overall ambition and priority. In addition, if you use metrics for measuring and managing your climate-related performance that fit neither of these categories, you should disclose them. The proposals also require disclosure of the targets that you are using to measure and manage your climate-related risks and opportunities and the performance against these. And I'll go into these in a bit more detail. We've tried to balance principles-based disclosures, providing flexibility for entities, along with prescriptive disclosures, such as the cross-industry metrics that provide comparability. Just a word on the time horizons. There are three that are relevant to the metrics: current, historical, and forward-looking. So current is the most recent reporting period and covers the same period as your financial statements. Historical data is for prior periods. In NZCS3, we propose 2 years of historic data in the form of comparatives. Forward-looking is future period data covering short, medium, and long-term horizons. Your forward-looking metrics may be based on methodologies such as your scenario analysis, trend analysis, sensitivity analysis, and simulations, as well as commitments and your climate-related targets. Your forward-looking metric might be more appropriately reported as a range based on assumptions about the future state of the world, which could be tied to one or more plausible climate scenarios. It's really helpful for primary users to disclose your climate-related metrics consistently from year to year. That helps facilitate comparative and trend analysis, although we recognise that you may change and develop better metrics over time. So cross-industry metrics. We have 8 cross-industry metric categories. These categories are expected to be relevant to all businesses, regardless of your industry and business model. Note that these are categories rather than individual metrics. This allows flexibility in reporting while retaining some consistency. And just again, another note, NZCS3 has that requirement for 2 years of comparatives for all metrics. And we have optional exemptions for these, that you can disclose none in the first year and only 1 year in the second, as well as a 2-year exemption for analysis of trends, if you choose to take these up. Next, I'll run through the more detailed requirements for greenhouse gas emissions and some examples for each of the other categories. So the proposals are for disclosure of gross greenhouse gas emissions. This means that you should report emissions before any trades, credits, or removals are applied. This includes accounting for your Scope 2 emissions using the location-based methodology and reporting removals separately. We believe this is a transparent approach which will focus attention on emission reductions rather than offsetting and can help to avoid allegations of greenwashing. If you are using the market-based emissions methodology for setting targets or as an internal metric, you would also disclose your emissions using this methodology. There are some additional requirements around the proposed greenhouse gas emission disclosures. So NZCS1 is primarily a disclosure rather than a measurement standard. And the XRB recognises that there are existing globally accepted and commonly used greenhouse gas emissions measurement and reporting standards, which include the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISO 14064, and associated with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the PCAF standard for financed emissions. Therefore, we are not proposing to mandate a single approach, but instead propose that you disclose the standard or standards that you use to measure your greenhouse gas emissions. We have also not required a particular consolidation approach. So while the choice of consolidation approach can move your emissions between scopes, we think that with the inclusion of Scope 3 emissions, the total emissions disclosed will be similar regardless of the consolidation approach that you've applied. Instead, again, you need to disclose which consolidation approach you used. And finally, you need to disclose any specific exclusions and justify why you've excluded them. This is important as it enables your primary users to see gaps, if any, in your emissions measurement. You'll note that we have dropped the requirement for an entity to prepare and publish a greenhouse gas emissions report in accordance with the recognised standard. This was in response to feedback from the consultation round that you could meet proposed disclosure requirements without preparing an emissions report. However, an entity will need to have sufficient internal records available for assurance practitioners when these disclosures are subject to assurance. There is a 1-year exemption for the disclosure of Scope 3 emissions if you want to take that up. And finally, there are proposed requirements in NZCS3 for the disclosure of methodologies, assumptions, and uncertainty in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. This is particularly important for your Scope 3, as there is generally a much greater level of uncertainty associated with these, and the results that you come up with can differ substantially depending on the methodology that you used. Data availability and analytical methodologies are rapidly evolving, and the direction for travel for emission reductions is as important as accuracy at this point. A reminder of what is included in Scope 3, it's the full value chain, upstream and downstream. And these are the yellow arrows shown on the slide. And of particular importance to the financial sector is that little box at the top of the arrow on the right, investments, which is the financed emissions. This is beyond the business travel, waste, T&D losses and freight that's been common practice for Scope 3 emissions measurement in New Zealand to date. Depending on your business, and likely at those in the financial sector, you'll find that emissions arising from investments, purchase goods and services, and use of other things may be many times greater than your direct emissions. And they'll be significantly more than what you're measuring to date if you're including those limited Scope 3. So it's really important, the Scope 3, this is where it's at. For most entities, this is where the most significant emissions risks and opportunities lie. And it's really important that the entity and the primary user understands these risks and opportunities. This graph is from the Carbon Disclosure Project's analysis, and it shows that among those financial institutions who measured their portfolio emissions, they were on average 700 times larger than their operational emissions. So to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, we need a whole economy transition. Every company, every bank, every insurer, and every investor will have to adjust their business models and develop credible plans for the transition and implement them. Private finance will probably fund the initiative and innovation of these plans, provided it has the necessary information, tools, and markets. So you will need to review more than the emissions generated by your own business activity, and this is why the financed emissions are so important. So measuring these Scope 3 emissions is the starting point to manage your risk and identify your opportunities associated with the greenhouse gas emissions. It's the tangible first step toward building trust that your financial institutions are integrating climate change into your core business of providing capital. And very importantly, measuring these emissions enables you to build this knowledge into your transition planning, as we talked about earlier. Now let's dive into some examples for some of the other cross-industry metrics. The following examples have been sourced from the TCFD guidance material, and once again, those disclaimers apply. They were made in the form of a voluntary regime and not as in response to the proposed NZCS1. So the intensity ratios express the greenhouse gas impact per unit of physical activity or unit of economic output. You can use a physical intensity ratio when aggregating or comparing across businesses that have similar products. And so for this example, they've looked at the emissions intensity for the power portfolio that Barclays hold. Or you could use an economic intensity ratio when aggregating or comparing across businesses that produce different products. Financial sector greenhouse gas ratios are often weighted average carbon intensity or portfolio carbon intensity. The next one, example, the transition risks. This disclosure allows users to better understand the potential financial vulnerability regarding issues such as possible impairment or stranding of assets, effects on the value of assets and liabilities, and changes in demand for products and services. So when thinking about your vulnerability to climate-related transition risks, you need to consider policy and legal risks, which reflect in changes in policy and litigation action, technology risks as emerging technologies impact the competitiveness of certain organisations, market risk from changes to supply and demand, and reputational risks tied to changing customer or community perception. So that was that right-hand side of the diagram that Jack showed earlier. The physical risks allow users to better understand potential financial vulnerability regarding issues such as impairment or stranding of assets, effects on the value of assets and liabilities, and the cost of business interruptions. When considering the types of climate-related physical risks that you might be vulnerable or that your investees might be vulnerable to, you need to consider both acute risks, storms, floods, wildfires, as we talked about before, and chronic risks such as the higher temperatures and sea level rise that refer to those long-term shifts in climate patterns. So physical risk will be specific to the geography where the assets or activities are located, and it might be so those that are vulnerable to acute risks from storms, or those that are more vulnerable to risks and chronic change of temperature or drought. The disclosure on climate-related opportunities provides insight into the position of entities relative to their peers and allows users to understand likely transition pathways and potential changes in revenue and profitability over time. There are several categories of climate-related opportunities that you could capture. They include resource efficiency from reducing energy, water and waste use of energy sources that emit low or no greenhouse gases, development of new products and services, access to new markets, and improved adaptive capacity and resilience. In addition to having different climate-related risks and opportunities, entities differ in the extent to which they are deploying capital to manage their risks and increase their opportunities. Disclosure of capital investment financing gives an indication of the extent to which long-term enterprise value might be affected. You can think about the capital invested, deployed or committed toward green and transition aligned activities, the capital invested, deployed or committed towards climate solution businesses and projects, or showing the proportion of loans, capital or assurance written on green assets as defined by different taxonomies. It can be helpful to present investments in traditional products alongside low emissions products so that users can understand the scale of investment in the different types of activities. So that would be potentially showing your investments in fossil fuels versus those in renewable energies. The internal carbon price or emissions pricing metric. Internal emissions pricing is a mechanism by which you can put a value on greenhouse gas emissions to facilitate analysis of actual and potential impacts of the risk and opportunities. It can help your primary users identify which business models are vulnerable to future policy responses and which are adapting their business models. You might use your internal emissions price to inform decision making, for example, by considering the impact of a given emissions price on a profitability as part of the investing, lending or insurance underwriting process. While internal emissions prices can take a variety of forms and amounts, an increasing number of companies are setting an internal notional or actional price on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted from their assets and investment projects so they can see how, where and when their emissions can affect their strategy, P&L statements and investment choices. There is no definitive source on what your emissions price should be, and there are a variety of ways that the cost of those emissions could be integrated into your business practices. The point is that you should disclose what you're using and preferably how you're doing it. Remuneration policies, they're pretty important incentives for achieving an entity's goals and objectives and may provide insight on the governance, oversight and accountability for managing climate-related issues. And again, those are linked to your governance disclosures. The ways which you link your executive compensation to performance on issues related to climate change will be specific to you and your governance structure. So you can choose to report the percentage of the executive's pay linked to climate considerations, or others discuss weighting factors or the total amount of compensation that could be impacted. Then we ask for disclosure of your targets. They refer to a specific level, threshold, quantity, or qualitative goal that you wish to meet over a defined time horizon in order to address its climate-related risks and opportunities. These targets should be aligned with your strategy and risk management goals. They should be linked to relevant metrics and they should be quantified and measurable. They should also identify the base year against which you will track progress. And back to a point Lisa, I think, made earlier, the time frame of your targets should be coherent across all targets and, if feasible, consistent with key dates tracked by international organisations such as the IPCC or regulators, or like things like the net zero by 2050 New Zealand target. The interim target is that checkpoint between the current period and the target end date where you assess your progress and make any adjustments to your plans and targets. Medium and long-term targets should have interim targets set at appropriate intervals. This might be 5 or 10 years, covering the full medium and long-term target time horizon. And don't forget, these horizons should ideally be consistent right throughout your disclosures. The targets should be supported by contextual narrative information on items such as organisational boundaries, methodologies, and underlying data and assumptions. And those are required out of the NZCS3 disclosure. We have also included proposed requirements to disclose if your greenhouse gas emissions targets are aligned with science and if you are relying on offsets to achieve those targets. So the next is an example cited by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero in their recommendations and guidance for financial institutions on net zero transition plans. And it's from the Italian banking group Intesa Sanpaolo. And this is in their business plan released in February this year. This disclosure communicates its 2030 financed emissions reduction interim targets for 4 priority high emitting sectors. It's also disclosed its 2030 emission reductions targets cover more than 60% of the non-financial corporates portfolio of its financed emissions. So this gives users an idea of the scale of this targets and which proportion of their portfolio is covered. Again, this is not made as for NZCS1, but it just gives you a bit of an idea about what's going on out there. Some other example categories for targets that you might like to look at beyond the straight greenhouse gas emissions targets and intensity reductions, which are in the top box of these 3. These are from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and they suggested that you might like to look at real economy transition targets, which can be set for financial products and services focused on real economy emissions reductions and climate solutions, and should reflect the key approaches taken by your entity. You might commit to increase capital allocation towards certain sectors or projects, or require net zero transition plans from your counterparties. The net zero implementation metrics you would be looking to set metrics that monitor and measure your progress against implementing your strategy. So some of the most common examples at present relate to engagement metrics, which can include voting or outcome metrics and more. There's heaps of them there. So again, these targets and metrics that you use should align to your strategy. The final section of the proposed standard is around assurance. So the legislation says that the greenhouse gas emissions must be assured for periods ending on or after the 27th of October 2024, and we're proposing that this is limited assurance. The assurance engagement will cover the disclosed scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, those additional requirements around the standard, the consolidation approach, and the exclusions, as well as the methodologies, assumptions and uncertainty disclosures that have come out of NZCS3. Amelia, over to you for the questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've got some really good questions here. And a lot of them are actually about how to understand the links between this section and the strategy section. So, for example, and before we do that, however, I would like to thank the FMA for making a really good point that your greenhouse gas emissions records are really needed for the regulator from the first year of reporting. Even though assurance doesn't kick in for most, for the first year, it's really important that you keep those good quality records on not just the greenhouse gas emissions, but everything that you do. This is a regulated scheme, so please do keep records of what it is that you're doing. And I know the FMA will be putting out more information on that in due course. So thank you for that. Okay, so do you expect a high level of duplication between the strategy section and the transition/physical risk metrics?
I think the metrics, I was just going to say, I think the metrics are really just a way of measuring your strategy and your risk. So they are well intertwined, and there's nothing that says you have to have these things separated out into sections. I would suggest if you're talking about your strategy and you're talking about how you will measure it, you would put your strategy metrics in that section. Jack?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the way I think about it is that the section on metrics and targets is sort of the long list of metrics and targets related to climate that you're using. And then, you'll be using some for risk management, some in the governance, some for strategy, some in the transition plan kind of context. So metrics and targets is the kind of long list, is the way I think about it.
And then, so there's a question that says, in the strategy section, there are requirements for current and anticipated impacts. Are they identical to impacts due to physical and transition risks in metrics and targets, or is there a different intent in those two sections?
Yeah, so a good example, maybe just what I was just saying just then. So I think entities will have metrics, and as Judy's just laid out, related to physical and transition risks. And those metrics, and there's good guidance from this on the TCFD, the most useful way to think about it, I think, when it comes to getting to the disclosure of financial impacts, is those metrics will be a useful input. But you may need to do further work on the back of that sort of input level information to actually disclose your financial impacts out the other side. So I would see a lot of the metrics, and the TCFD has a useful diagram where they put it together in this kind of funnel, is that, metrics on those things are useful input for financial impact information, but you more than likely need to do more work than just relying on a few metrics that you've already got.
And another one specific to the transition plan. So how does disclosure of transition risk/physical risk within the cross-industry metrics differ to some of the information being disclosed as part of strategy, i.e. the transition plan? Could you present the transition plan with the metrics to cover both disclosure requirements?
Yeah.
I'd say absolutely.
Yeah. That's right. So, and in that GFANS framework, that they have for a transition plan, there's basically a metrics section of the transition plan, and the metrics coming through quite a lot. So this is where, it's funny because we've always, I think, if you have a TCFD sort of standard goggles on, you're going governance, risk management, strategy, metrics and targets. Well, all the metrics and targets go over there. But increasingly now, where the demand is to be able to demonstrate a credible transition plan, now there's a lot of these metrics coming back through again, but not necessarily all the exact same ones. But if you look at what the GFANS kind of expectations are around those metrics, it's quite a few. So, the ambition is quite high, and the bar's rising really quickly around what primary users are expecting in those transition plans, and then the ability to tell the story and link it all together coherently, I think, is a lot.
Yeah, and just further to Jack's point, I think that the disclosure, the metrics, a lot of those metrics around the transition and physical risk and things should be how you can tell if your transition planning and your risk management stuff are working. So actually, they should be the ones that you're using to test. And we have allowed a lot of flexibility for entities in those places to define. That's why they're categories, the ones that they're using to manage and measure. And so that's how you demonstrate your plan is succeeding, because your metrics are improving. The outcome of your metrics.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that point is really important. We really want to be able to communicate, entities to be able to communicate to primary users what it is that they are doing. So what things are you actually using, rather than saying, hey, here's a whole lot of stuff you have to report on for compliance sake. It's about saying, what are you actually using in your side, your entity. Okay, so a question, Judy. Is it okay to exclude investments from our Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions if we state this in our summary of specific exclusions? It's a work in progress for us.
So there is that 1 year exclusion under the adoption provisions at the moment. I think the danger if you exclude, so if there is no methodology and you're not able to measure an area at the moment, under the Scope 3 standards, that is a justifiable reason for excluding them. If it's just that you haven't got around to them, then that's a discussion it's not a discussion between yourselves and your auditors. You need to tell people that you've excluded them. You need to justify why you've excluded them. When we get to assurance, it may cause them to have a modified assurance engagement if they think that you haven't covered everything that you have. I'm not the assurance expert on that, but the point of the standard is to tell us what you have measured and then highlight in big, that's the exclusion. Then the exclusion is to highlight in big red letters the material stuff that you've missed out, because that helps to put the stuff that you have disclosed into context.
And we've got a question on timing of assurance. So what is the first year assurance will be required for reporting entities with an Australian parent company that finishes its financial year on 30 June?
So I'm assuming that from that question that the New Zealand subsidiary or branch that's the climate reporting entity also has a financial year that finishes on the 30th of June. If that is the case, the first year that their assurance would be required would be the year ending June 2025. That's the period after the first financial period that finishes after that. If you have a September year end for your entity, then that's September 2025, but you must report that same period for your financial statements.
And I think, yeah, the important thing is who is the client reporting entity? You know, it is about the year end for the client reporting entity itself. And if that client reporting entity in New Zealand has a different year end to the Australian parent, it's about what the client reporting entity here in New Zealand, your year end is. Okay. Lots of questions. We're going to do our best to get to all of them. As you mentioned, Scope 3 is 700 times operational emissions. There is currently a 1 year transition exemption. Is the XRB's expectation that by year 2, entities are covering the full range of Scope 3, or is it a case of saying what Scope 3 is in and out? We've covered it a little bit, but I think it was worth answering again.
Yep, so I guess 2 things to think about for Scope 3 and for the whole standard, in fact, is what is material to your primary user. So you want to start with the most material stuff. We are hoping that you can get to everything by scope by the end of year 2 after that 1 year exemption, but there is that exclusion category there and you need to justify and explain what you have excluded. Yeah, but start with your biggest because that's the most material and that'll have the most interest for your primary user.
And we had another question, which I think we've just answered, but I'll read it out just in case, which is for finance emissions, are we expected to disclose Scope 1 to 3 emissions of our borrowers immediately, or is alignment with PCAF, i.e. oil and gas Scope 3, 1 to 3 immediately, and other sectors Scope 3 only over time?
So if you are using the PCAF standard and you say that you are measuring in accordance with PCAF, then you can follow their guidance. It's just the point is a disclosure standard is being very clear what you have and have not done so that your primary user knows how to understand it. And Scope 3 is a work in progress everywhere, and users need to understand, I think, how much uncertainty is associated with those. But however, the disclosures are still useful no matter how rough, maybe not no matter how rough and ready, but we appreciate they're a bit rough and ready and they still provide valuable information for users.
Thanks, Judy. I've got another question. Is assurance of greenhouse gas emissions by the parent company covering the New Zealand entity's emissions sufficient to meet these requirements?
I think the assurance will need to be undertaken in accordance with XRB standards, and they would need to consider materiality of the New Zealand climate reporting entity in its own right, not as a subset of the parent parent. So there's a couple of things going on there. I think as long as they pay due attention to the New Zealand emissions and the New Zealand emissions are able to be separated out and understood, then I would think it would probably meet that, but you would need a separate assurance opinion for the New Zealand entity. That is what is required under the legislation.
Thanks, Judy. So given the brevity of the statement on greenhouse gas methodology used, where would you expect additional information about assumptions, uncertainties, etc., to be included for greenhouse gas calculation?
So two things. The way that we've laid out the disclosure requirements isn't that this is the way you have to lay out your answer. So there are a lot of requirements in NZCS3, not just around the methodologies assumptions, but they should go, so there's methodologies and assumptions that should go with all of the metrics. And so every single metric should have a brief summation of how you've got there and what you've done and what's included, what your key assumptions are, what the key uncertainties are associated with each and every metric that you disclose. And you may find you put some of that detail in an appendix and off-site. We have rules around the disclosure of where location of where disclosures are, as Amelia pointed out earlier. So just have a think. You want to be able to explain to your primary users in the most coherent way possible and give them the high level understanding about what is in and out for each of the metrics that you've used.
Thanks, Judy. Now we have a pretty curly question, which is about MIS managers. Where a bank owns an MIS, so MIS but for a manager of an investment scheme, the MIS has to report on the financed emissions of its schemes. But should those financed emissions also be reported as part of the bank's Scope 3 financed emissions, given that the bank does not own the money being invested, i.e. 0% attribution?
That's a very curly question. You've already measured it. I'd potentially pop it in there. Up to you. You need to have a look at the standards and make your own interpretation of them. If you do not have investments into the scheme yourself, you may choose not to do them, except if you've looking at your organisational boundary for what you're reporting as your climate disclosures for your entity as a bank, you may need to include them if they're within your boundary.
Thanks, Judy. And yeah, if you're interested in MIS managers, we have our deep dive next week, so come along to that as well. So another question about finance emissions. Given the expected magnitude of finance emissions for financial firms, do you have a view on appropriate data quality scores as defined under PCAF?
No. It's useful though to have a look at those data quality scores and have a look. It's how you can best portray to your primary users the reliability of the data that you're disclosing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Judy. That's everything on metrics and targets. We'll just move on to guidance.
Thanks, Amelia. So finally, let's take a look at how we can lower the overall degree of difficulty you're facing in preparing your disclosures under NZCS1. And I thought we should start with a quick overview of the XRB staff guidance documents that you can call on now or expect to see in the future. And we have previously published sectoral scenario analysis guidance, fact sheets on scenario analysis and measuring your emissions, and a director's preparation guide. And all of those are available from the resources section of the XRB website. In July, we published guidance for all sectors and sector-specific guidance for MIS managers. And we also have sector-specific guidance for banks and insurers in development, along with targeted guidance for scenario analysis at entity level and for transition planning. But what we want to focus on today are the two documents that were published in July, along with the exposure draft. Now, these guidance documents are live, so they're working drafts, so we're very keen to have your feedback on them. And I'll now explain a little bit about our approach to the development of the guidance, its structure, and the nature of its content. We set about the process of guidance development with three core objectives. Our first objective is to deepen understanding of climate-related risk and opportunity. So the regime isn't about tick box compliance, it's about improving the information available to investors, and doing so, improving the resilience of disclosing entities to climate-related risk. Our second objective is to illustrate primary user needs. And we tried to illustrate as clearly as possible for preparers what the needs of primary users are. And we're hoping with that information will help to clarify how preparers could approach disclosure in the most useful way. And finally, we're trying to build some consistency, and we're aiming to do that primarily via enhancing preparers' understanding, both of climate-related risk and opportunity and primary user needs, but also through building transparency and coherence in the methods and approaches that we're describing. So this is an example of the guidance accompanying disclosure 13B regarding climate-related risks and opportunities. And as you see, it opens with an explanation of a primary user perspective, and it goes on to describe an approach that can be taken to the disclosure, and it also signals that first-time adoption relief is available. And in the final box there, it highlights some useful external resources. With this example, we also provide an illustration of how entities could go about the disclosure. So sort of touching back on that idea that not everything has to be narrative. If you've got tables and graphs and some way to illustrate what you're talking about, then definitely go to it. So this is the typical structure and content of the guidance documents. So please let us know what you make of it and what, if anything, you'd like to see done differently as we continue to develop these and other guidance documents. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Steph. We have a really important question on the guidance. Should anything included in the guidance but not in the climate standards still be considered to be mandatory requirements?
The standard is the mandatory component of this regime. The guidance is there to help you to get to the standard. So
Yeah, absolutely not. The guidance is not mandatory. Guidance is staff guidance. Yeah, the standards have the mandatory disclosure requirements in it. So thank you for asking that question to help us clarify that. I do have one other risk management question, which I'm going to put to you, Steph. What would you consider as integrated risk management practices, greenhouse gas metrics, targets, and disclosures aligned with strategy? Can you give examples of these key subjects aligned? I'm not sure if that question makes sense to you.
That is quite a challenging question. Integrated risk management practices, greenhouse gas metrics, targets and disclosures. My good friend Jack's camera has just popped on, so that's a human shield if ever I've seen one.
Yes, here I come. I was looking at that one 5 minutes ago, and I think this is where I would just draw a distinction. If we think about different examples of voluntary TCFD disclosures, some of these basically world leaders like Aviva, are taking quite a fundamentally different approach to somebody who may be, not necessarily wanting to be ambitious on climate change and seeing it more of a compliance exercise. So the Avivas of the world, they're really thinking about this in the boardroom as a strategic issue. So they're thinking about how we're going to reposition ourselves to, deliver on our strategy and meet our objectives. And then everything's sort of flowing down from that. And then if you think about some of the other examples, you can just see that it's, okay, we need to manage risk. Here's a process, and okay, we want to add some things into our strategy. But, so it's quite different. And really, I think a pretty easy litmus test is, is the entity trying to be a leader on climate change, or are they approaching it from more of a compliance perspective? And so I think if you get that top-down mandate and then the strong governance, then everything really sort of flows from there in terms of coherent picture of what's happening with the strategy, good risk management processes coming through, and then appropriate targets and metrics which all come from there. So I think, there's obvious differences when you look at these voluntary examples, which may help you to sort of get a gist of just how different they are. So I'd encourage looking at some of the big world leaders like Allianz and Aviva, and maybe compare to some of the smaller entities in Australasia.
Thanks. And the person who's asked that question, which is, you've been talking about alignment of disclosures, greenhouse gases, metrics, practices with the company strategy. So yes.
Okay. Right.
Everything should, the intent is very much that there is alignment between what it is that you're doing. If your company strategy is over here and you've got all your stuff over here, that's probably not a very good sign about how you're integrating climate change into the work that you're doing within the organization.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we'd see that as integration, that this work is integrated with the wider strategy of the organization.
A question on guidance. The guidance examples generally point to impact of actions being taken by the entity. What disclosure of impact of not taking action is expected?
Well, I think the primary example of that would be in disclosure of anticipated impacts under scenario analysis, where entities don't have a choice necessarily of what scenario they'll find themselves in, so they need to be exploring what the potential impacts of those plausible different futures could be, absent any action on their behalf.
Thank you. And the comment here has come in. So yes, you're looking for integrated reporting. Absolutely, your disclosures should be that is a key principle of the TCFD. TCFD was all about integrating climate into your financial decision making. So yeah, definitely looking to make sure these things are not kind of siloed. We have a question which I think I'm going to put to you, Jack. I'm keen for some more information on the impacts/financial impacts and the requirement that these be disclosed without considering the steps entities can take to mitigate these risks. If we know these risks won't manifest due to actions we can and will take, what is the point of disclosing these to an end user?
Yeah, awesome question. I think that this is where primary users and the way the TCFDs put it in guidance, we would say that there's just a few dimensions that need to be laid out to avoid masking what are potentially quite disruptive future climate-related impacts. So basically, the way, as I said, there's sort of three prongs: is what are your risks and opportunities, and then what are the plausible, reasonably expected impacts and financial impacts of those out into the future. And then what are you doing in response to get on top of them? And that's where a lot of the information that would be in the transition plan, we would expect to be, here's how we're planning to actually get on top of, what we can control. But if you were to just leap to the second one and say, because we have our transition plan and maybe it's going to cost us X amount of money over the next 5 years, that's it. That's the whole story. It's not that simple when it comes to climate change, because some of those climate-related risks and opportunities and their associated financial impacts are not within your control. So they're dependent on what the global community does, and whether we rapidly reduce emissions, get to 1.5 degrees, or whether we continue down this higher emissions path, and where we see more physical impacts, which, we may not really want, but that would be, a result of that kind of scenario coming to pass. So I'd say, think about it as a multi-dimensional issue, particularly for forward-looking anticipated financial impacts, which is sort of, what's your rough exposure, what are you going to do about it, and what's the cost of that, and then make sure you disclose it in a way where you're not masking, potential financial impacts that are outside of your control. And, that is what primary users want to see.
Thanks, Jack. And then one last question, which I'll take on, which is, will there be connections between climate-related financial disclosures and nature-related financial disclosures in New Zealand in the future? So the XRB has the ability to issue mandatory climate-related disclosure standards. However, we do not have the ability to issue mandatory sustainability standards on anything else. So we can issue, however, non-binding guidance on non-financial reporting. So we are taking a lot of interest in what is happening on broader sustainability topics. So the ISSB does have their general sustainability standard that they've recently consulted on. We're paying attention to the Tcfd and all sorts of other things. So definitely watch this space here in New Zealand, but at this stage, that type of disclosure would be a guidance rather than necessarily a mandatory standard. And finally, will slides and recording from the session be made available? Absolutely. So we have behind the scenes, very busy people working on getting these up on our YouTube page and on our website. So if you are an MIS manager, just would like to remind you, we have one more deep dive session, which is next week. Click on the events tab of our website to register for that. And as with this one, that will be recorded and the PowerPoint will go up for that. In the main consultation document, we have 6 main consultation questions. Really keen to get feedback on these. They focus on user needs, on the practicality of preparing the required disclosures, first-time adoption provisions, and draft staff guidance, among other things. So please do have a look. We really want your feedback. We value it hugely, and it's your last chance to have a say before this consultation closes on the 26th of September. So we really need submissions in by that date so we can issue the final standards in December. So I just like to say thank you so much for everyone for attending. Really valued all your questions and participation. Please check out our website or email us, the team, climate@xrb.gov.nz if you have any questions. And we will look forward to hearing your feedback. Ka kite.